multi-generational computer modeling activity that's being done, and it's kind of fabulous, but it's simply not good enough to set policy on, whereas they, of course, think it is. And that was the essential difference. But, to the extent that there's controversy about my views, I must say it's really kind of amazing. I mean, because I never thought the idea that you can't predict the future would be controversial. I mean, now when I talk to audiences, I get up there and I say, can we agree that you can't predict the future unless you guys think you're all psychic? But if you're not psychic, then we really have to face some cold realities about how unpredictable the future is. And I talk to them about, for example, what a person in the year 1900 would predict for the year 2000. The big problem that a person in 1900 would see was, where will they get all the horses for the year 2000? And what will we do with all the horse shit? And, there's a very interesting picture floating around on the internet, which is said to be from the 1954 issue of Popular Mechanics, showing the RAND Corporation's mock-up of a home computer. And it's really silly and very amusing, and unfortunately, it's a fake. It's great, but it's a fake. But I was sufficiently intrigued by this that I went back to Popular Mechanics to look at what they did actually say about the home computer. Do you know what they said?
No.
Nothing at all. Do you know why?
You hadn't imagined it.
That's right. No one thought it was possible.
What sort of reactions are you getting, both from academics, researchers, environmentalists, activists? Who's saying what?
Well, I'm quite interested actually in the number of people who have responded by raising their level of skepticism. And I'm pleased by the number of people who think it's a fun ride to take, it's an exciting story, which always makes me happy. But unfortunately, and it's one of the things I criticize in the novel itself, unfortunately, a lot of environmental thinking has taken on a fundamentalist tinge as if it were religious. That's bad for a number of reasons. The biggest one, I think, is that we really do need a good environmental movement. We really do have an environment that needs our attention. It really is not as good as it could be and should be. There are huge areas that we just don't have information. Not the areas that are usually talked about, because I think the environmental movement is not doing what it really needs to do.
What should it be doing? Well,
the first area of concern that I have, looking toward the future, because I like to hike, I like to be out in nature, and it's become clear to me that we don't know how to preserve what we call wilderness. We don't know how to do it. And so that, for example, the test case of this, or the easiest example, is the poster child, is Yellowstone National Park. It was the first national park. It's been a national park for more than 100 years. And our management of it has been kind of disastrous. I mean, there's now raw sewage coming out of the ground there. But it isn't only Yellowstone, and it isn't really only America. In parks in Africa and parks in India and wherever there are such parks, it turns out the difficulty of being a good steward is vastly greater than anybody imagined. And the core that I've come to conclude is that we don't know how to do this. We don't know how to manage. I mean, the environment is a complex system. And what we know now about how you interact with complex systems tells us that we can't really be sure what the effect is of any of our actions. And we have to be constantly monitoring, constantly probing, constantly re-examining what we've been doing, and all of that behavior, even to say, I don't know, all of that behavior is not suited to a fundamentalist philosophy. Fundamentalists are really good at saying, I know the answer and you don't. But when nobody knows the answer, then we better get into a more scientific headset and out of a more religious headset.
Do you think it's an area of science that money will be devoted to allow this kind of research, to answer some of these questions?
No, I don't think so. I'm very, very disheartened as I think about the future because, if you look at the behavior of every generation in this area, every generation says, well, the last generation, what a bunch of idiots they were. Look at the stupid mistakes they did. They got all the wolves out of Yellowstone because they thought they were preserving elk, because they thought the elk were becoming extinct, which was wrong, and it was wrong to get the wolves out. It was wrong to move the grizzly bears, blah, 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 blah. But Now, this is a new generation. We see all their mistakes, and we're not going to make those mistakes. We know what we're doing. And unfortunately, what they don't seem to realize is that the past generation thought it knew what it was doing too. Every generation thinks they know what they're doing, and the only real change is going to happen when somebody gets up and says, folks, we don't know. We better go learn. And, there are some people, very few, doing fundamental research in this area. I've identified some in the book. There's a psychologist named Dietrich Dorner who got academic colleagues to work on computer simulations of different kinds of environments. One was a town in Maine, one was a desert community in the Sahara. And what he found almost immediately was that the great majority of people who set out to manage these environments ran them into the ground. They made everything much worse, which is, of course, the ordinary human experience. And so he then studied of the relatively few people who did the job well, what did they do? How did they interact with this environment? And the answer was they didn't have a philosophy that they were too attached to going in. They monitored their behavior very carefully. They looked for unexpected consequences, and when they saw them, they acted immediately. And the summary of what his thinking was that the people who were dogmatic would come in and say, this is the way to do it, and then as time went on, and of course that didn't turn out to be the way, they made fewer and fewer interactions until finally it all went bad and they blamed something. The people who were successful started out with less of a philosophical conviction, and as time went on, they made more and more interactions. They kept modifying, kept revising, kept trying to refine, and they didn't blame anybody. They were successful. So, we're setting aside more wilderness area, which is fabulous. I'm entirely in favor of it, and it would be even greater if we knew how to take care of it, which we don't.
What about the rest of the world? Are they responding to the problem better than the U.S.? Is there more research going on in Europe or in Asia?
No, and I think one of my criticisms of having a focus on the year 2100.
And by that you mean the Kyoto Protocol?
Yeah, all that stuff, that intense future orientation, the notion of the long-range view, which has never been successful. If you look at the predictions of the Club of Rome, which was a group that did the early computer projections in 1973, they said we would run out of all sorts of raw resources by 1993. We haven't run out of anything, which is not to say that we may not eventually, but it is to say that those predictions were significantly in error. And they also predicted that by the year 2020, we'd have a world population of 14 billion, and there isn't anybody who believes that we're going to get anywhere near that.
In State of Fear, you have a character, an academic, a professor emeritus, who describes something that he calls the political, legal, media complex. And he asserts that it's replaced the Cold War as an organizing principle for modern society. Is that something you believe, or was that a fictional device? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I do believe it. And I think my way of thinking about this is the United States was organized as a government by a bunch of really smart people. And one of the core principles of the way that they organized it was checks and balances. They had institutions that were really either opposed to one another or in some way monitoring and tolerating a certain level of conflict. When I look at modern society today, what I see is that politicians and media and lawyers, and don't forget, we have 3/4 of all the lawyers in the entire planet, so they're a phenomenally powerful group, that all these three really have a stake in the promotion of ongoing fears and crises. And there is no countervailing institution that has as its purpose or has a reason to stand up and say, no, don't be afraid of that one. No, that one's fake. No, don't be buying into that. The poster child for false fears is, of course, Y2K, which is recent enough that most people can still remember it, and also was clear in the sense that for months, years really, we heard fears expressed about what terrible things are going to happen. Airplanes are going to drop out of the sky. Financial markets are going to collapse. People sold their houses. they withdrew all their money, they moved to higher ground.